Hello and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we will be going over everything that you need to know in order to care for a royal python. In this video, we will be educating you on everything that you need to know in order to provide great outstanding care, as well as an enclosure which they can thrive within. So to begin with, royal pythons, also known as ball pythons, are native to Western Africa, the South Sahara Desert, as well as northern through to western Uganda. In the wild, royal pythons have a lifespan of around 10 to 15 years, and in captivity, their lifespan is usually between 15 to 30 years. Adult male royal pythons usually get to a size of around 2.5 foot to about 4 foot, and adult females usually reach a size between 4 foot to 6 foot in length. This species of snake is a nocturnal species, which means they're primarily active during the night time and mainly asleep during the day. That being said though, they do come out a lot during the daytime to actually stretch out and also bask. In the wild, they can usually be found either in trees or in burrows or any sort of tight hiding spaces. They do like to feel nice and tucked away. Their wild diet usually consists of eating mice, rats, multi-mammates, small mammals, and also small birds. And in captivity, obviously, we defrost frozen mice, rats, multi-mammates, and also chicks. Royal pythons make a great option for those looking to get into the hobby and also for those who are experienced and have reptiles already. They are very inexpensive to set up, they're cheap to maintain, they're very docile, they're great for handling, and all round very straightforward to actually care for. So now that you know a little about this species, let's move on to discussing their temperature requirements. So this species of snake needs a temperature range between 24 to 33 degrees Celsius, which is 75 to 91 degrees Fahrenheit. On the cool side of your enclosure, so the side that you haven't got heating, your temperatures should offer a range between 24 degrees Celsius to 27 degrees Celsius, which is 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And on your hot side or your basking area, you want your temperature range to sit between 30 to 33 degrees Celsius, which is 86 to 91 degrees Fahrenheit. The ambient temperature usually sits around 27 degrees Celsius, which is 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, moving on to the humidity requirements, royal pythons need a humidity range of around 50 to 80%. This can be maintained through misting the enclosure with a spray bottle. You'll probably only need to mist the enclosure once the humidity drops down to around 40 to 50%. And then when you spray it, it'll boost it back up to 80%. And it usually lasts a few days before you actually have to mist again. Now, if you add sphagnum moss into your enclosure, this will help retain humidity for longer, and it will also keep that level of humidity higher. Now, I will also mention that if you notice that your snake is going into shed, I usually will start misting the enclosure more frequently and more often, just to keep that level of humidity higher than it usually is. This is purely because, obviously, if they're going into shed, they're about to remove their skin, and you want the skin to be able to separate from them in one piece rather than loads of little pieces. Basically, if you don't have enough humidity, your snake will eventually shed their skin in tiny little pieces rather than just one straight solid shed. So yeah, like I say, when they're in shed or going into blue, which is where their eyes go like a blue cloudy color, that's when I would start misting the enclosure down a little bit more heavily and a bit more frequently, just to keep that level a lot higher. So it's just worth keeping in mind. So now let's talk about their enclosure sizing. You're going to want to provide an enclosure which is at least the length of the snake. This is because royal pythons do love to come out and they like to fully stretch themselves out. So for a juvenile enclosure, for a snake like this sort of size, as you can see on the screen, I would recommend a minimum of a 3 foot by 1.5 by 1.5 foot. A lot of people tend to just go for the 3 by 2 by 2 foot enclosures because it will provide them a bit more sort of depth and height. But like I said, the minimum I'd recommend going for a juvenile royal python would be the 3 foot by 1.5 by 1.5 foot. So now for a sub-adult to an adult royal python, your minimum requirement would be a 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot vivarium. Now, obviously, if you can go bigger, I would highly suggest you do, because they will make use of all of that space. I also recommend, if you have a female, I would highly recommend going for a bigger enclosure than a 4 by 2 by 2, because obviously they can get bigger than males can. But like I said, the minimum requirement that I'd recommend to people would be the 4 by 2 by 2 vivariums. Now, I will say that even if you have a baby or a juvenile, something that's sort of similar to this sort of size of a royal python, you can just go straight for the bigger enclosure from the day that you buy them and completely skip the 3 by 1.5 by 1.5. Obviously, you're going to save money that way, but on top of that, they're going to make use of all of that space from such a young age, and they're going to really enjoy it. So if you can provide the space, I definitely would recommend just going for the adult size enclosure to begin with. Moving on to the heating and lighting systems for a 4 by 2 by 2 vivarium. Let's go over the heating first. The first thing that you're going to need to buy yourself is one of these ceramic lamp holders. ProRep also make a version. They're virtually the same. Make sure it's ceramic and not plastic, because the plastic ones tend to melt over time and can become a fire hazard. On top of that, you're also going to want to make sure that you get yourself one of these bad boys. It's a lamp guard to go around that ceramic lamp holder, which we've just shown you. It's important that you make sure you do get one of these lamp guards, because obviously royal pythons do love to climb, and they will try to climb around that bulb and try and, you know, wrap themselves around it. So obviously, if you haven't got a guard, they could burn themselves, which is obviously something that we don't want. Now, the next thing on your shopping list is going to be a dimming thermostat. Now, make sure it's a dimming thermostat for the bulbs which I'm just about to recommend to you. What the thermostat does is it controls and regulates the temperature to which you set it to. So on the device, you're going to set the bar skin temperature, and then you're going to run the probe in to the enclosure, which is on the thermostat, and then that will sense the heat temperature, and it will adjust the bulb accordingly to match the temperature which you have set on the thermostat. What this obviously does is it prevents the bulb from constantly heating up and getting way too hot for your snake. And obviously we don't want our beautiful royal pythons getting way too hot. For the basking bulbs themselves, personally, I would recommend a incandescent spot lamp bulb. Now this is the 100-watt one. Some people will use the 75-watt version of this. I've never had someone use a 50-watt in the 4 by 2 by 2 for a royal python, but obviously it's an option. But I find a lot of people seem to be going for the 100 watts and then obviously controlling it on that thermostat. An alternative option would be the halogen bulbs. They do 75 watts and also 100 watts. Now personally, I find that the 100-watt halogen is a bit too hot. I do find the 75-watt halogens work better for the royal python. It will kind of come down to trial and error, and you'll just have to see what the temperatures are like with different wattages within your enclosure. But like I said, from my personal experience, if you're going for the spot lamp version, I find the 100 watts are the better one. And if it's the halogen, go for the 75 watts. Now, I will also mention that in your enclosure, I'd recommend you put a nice piece of rock or like a nice bit of wood for your snake to climb over underneath the heat lamp as the basking platform. Now, personally, I would recommend a rock more because it will hold that heat a lot better. And obviously, if it's holding the heat, it's going to reflect off of that item and provide what's called inf-C, which is going to help with digestion and underbelly heat. Now, personally, I recommended these two type of bulbs purely because they offer what's called UVA, which is different to UVB, but we'll touch on UVB in a minute. but because they offer UVA, it's part of the sun's natural light spectrum, so it's obviously going to benefit your snake. Now, because it provides UVA and also light, it's going to benefit your royal python a hell of a lot better than a black ceramic heater emitter will. Personally, I only ever use the black ceramic heater emitters for boosting temperatures at night time, or in a enclosure which an area is a little too cold. You can run the ceramic heater emitter to boost the temperatures there. But I don't really understand why people use them as their main source of heating, because they're virtually a radiator. What they don't do is they don't simulate the sun. And obviously what we're trying to do is replicate the wild as much as possible. I'll show you what they look like. This is a black ceramic heater emitter. Like I said, if you want to use them for nighttime heating, just to keep those temperatures above the minimum requirement, then they work great for that. They're going to provide heat and also provide no light. So for during the nighttime use, they're going to work great. But personally, I wouldn't recommend using it as your main source of heating, especially for if your snake does like to come out and bask underneath the heat lamp. Now, if you do decide that you want to provide a ceramic heater for obviously during the night time, make sure that you buy a pulse thermostat, not a dimming thermostat. Otherwise, it's not going to work correctly. Now, for the smaller enclosures, like the 3 by 1.5 by 1.5 foot enclosures, I would recommend either using a 50-watt heating bulb as opposed to like a 100-watt, because obviously it's a smaller enclosure. But obviously there is another option which you can go for. In the smaller enclosures, you can use a heat mat and then running the heat mat onto a mat stat. Again, this is great for during the night time, and obviously it's not going to simulate the sun, but it does do the job for the smaller enclosures. But like I said, if you can provide a heat lamp in the smaller enclosure, it will benefit your snake a lot more than a heat mat. However, I thought I'd include it because obviously it does do the job, and obviously it is an option and it is cheaper than going down the route of the heating bulb. Now, you're going to need a way to test your temperatures inside your enclosure. So personally, I recommend you getting one of these. It's the Exoterra infrared digital thermometer. Obviously, I recommend this purely because you can actually test everywhere within inside the enclosure as opposed to one specific point. I highly recommend one of these. They are a really good bit of kit. They do it in Celsius and also in Fahrenheit. Your other options are these two. This is a dial version, and all you simply do is stick it inside the enclosure. And then you have this digital version of this, which obviously displays the temperature on the screen, and you run the probe into the enclosure to where you want it. On top of that, you're going to need a way to test your humidity as well. So here's two options for you. Again, you just stick this one in the enclosure and it will tell you the percentage of humidity. And then again, obviously it will display the humidity percentage on the screen, and you just simply run the probe. So now let's move on to the lighting, shall we? Now, a lot of people say that snakes don't need UVB. Now, personally, I would argue that you should provide UVB, especially for if it's their forever home. Now, the reason being is obviously royal pythons do like to come out during the day to actually bask and warm up. So obviously every time that they do actually come out to bask, they're going to reap the benefits that UVB offers purely because you've installed one. So obviously for this reason alone, that's why I would obviously recommend that you buy one. UVB has a hell of a lot of health benefits for your royal python. They don't need much UVB, but we'll touch on that in a split second. But like I say, UVB will help your snake absorb calcium a lot better and more efficiently. It also is part of the vitamin D3 cycle, so it will provide the D3 for them. It will help their immune system. It will also help their livers and improve their kidneys. And it also just promotes a lot more natural behaviors. So for all of these reasons combined, that is why I would recommend that you do buy UVB and you do provide it. So the UVB percentage that I'd recommend would be a 2.5%. They do a 2.5% 14 watt T5 UVB kit. This would be perfect for your snake. Try and have it more towards the hot side, so then obviously when they're basking, they're going to make the most of this. But I find that these kits work great for the royal pythons and also corn snakes. Like I say, it's 2.5%, so it's only a little bit of UV, but it's just enough for these snakes. Now, if you've gone bioactive, I would highly recommend you get yourself one of these, which is a Jungle Dawn LED bar. This is the 34 watt one. You can use either the 34 watt or the 51 watt in the 4x2x2 enclosures. Personally, I find the 34 watt is just big enough. And obviously what this does is it's going to help promote the plant growth for the live plants for your bioactive enclosure system. Even if you haven't gone bioactive, I'd still recommend installing one of these Jungle Dawns, purely because they do give off quite a lot of light. On top of that, they don't use a lot of electricity because obviously they're an LED, and it will seriously brighten up your enclosure and also help your snake determine the difference between day and night. Like I say, these Jungle Dawns are great, and personally I'd still recommend installing one even if you haven't gone bioactive. But obviously if you have gone bioactive, you're definitely going to need one, because obviously you want your plants to keep growing and you want them to thrive as much as possible. I forgot to mention that for your Jungle Dawn and also your UVB lighting, you're going to want to make sure that you get yourself one of these. This is the Lamp Guard Pro. And obviously this does a similar sort of thing to your heat lamp cage. It's basically a cage to go around your lighting to prevent your snake from getting up close to it and pulling out the UVB tube, as well as getting too close to the light. I will also mention that obviously I suggested and recommended that you use the 2.5% 14 watt UVB, but you can also use 6% T5 UVB kits. They work too. Just make sure that you get the right size for the size of your enclosure. But I wouldn't go anywhere above 6%. But like I say, personally, I just always use these just purely because they don't need much of the UVB. So now let's move on to suitable substrates which you can use for your royal python. But before we go over the substrate, I'm going to put this little fella back into his vivarium, and we're going to get my adult male out, just so then you can see the difference between a young snake and also an adult snake. So this is my pet royal python. This is Nova. He is a Black Eye Lucy and he's an adult male. And he will be joining us whilst we go over substrate and the last few bits of this video. So, some suitable substrates which you can use for your royal pythons. The first option you could use would be the cocoa husk, which looks like this. This is a big brick. It also comes as a small brick, like that. This is a great option. It's also your cheapest option. You'll need to mist down the substrate once it's dry. To actually make the substrate, you have to mix it with hot water and it will expand out from being in the brick. And then obviously you put it in your enclosure. But like I say, it works great and it's been no issues using. I've never had a problem using it. Like I say, you will just need to mist it once the humidity drops down to about 40 to 50%. Now for the second option, I've never actually personally tried it. So I haven't really got much of an opinion on it. However, I thought I'd include this option because a lot of people seem to be using it and they seem to be using it just fine. Again, I've never used it for royal pythons, so I can't really say whether it's amazing or not. Maybe we can test that in a future video. But the second option would be the orchid bark. Like I said, obviously people are using it just fine with no issues. Personally, I would recommend the cocoa husk over this stuff. But again, it's down to personal preference. Now, your third option would be the jungle bio. This also is a good alternative as a substrate. Again, you'll just need to mist it once it drops down in humidity, and obviously you want it to boost it back up. The jungle bio is a great option. It's sort of a bioactive mix. It has got like sort of wood chips in it. Again, you'll need to make sure that you mist it once the humidity drops down to 40 to 50% to boost it back up to between 60 and 80%. Now, in my opinion, there is a better alternative to the jungle bio, and that is this one, which I will show you. So that is the earth mix. If you've gone bioactive, I definitely recommend you use this. I use this for all my bioactive enclosures. But yeah, like I say, I've got never had any problems using it. It's a great substrate. And obviously, if you've got live plants, it's going to obviously help promote root growth as well as help the plants grow. Now, if you want to go for a more specialized bioactive mix, this is what I personally do with my snake enclosures, or should we say my royal python enclosures. So what you basically do is you get 60% of this earth mix, and then you mix it with 25% of the cocoa husk, and then 10% of the sphagnum moss, and then about 5% of the desert sand. It doesn't need to be much sand. It basically just holds a little bit more of the burrows, but you really don't need much of the sand. And to be fair, you can probably get away with not using the sand. But personally, that's what I do as a bioactive mix for my bioactive enclosures for these guys. On top of that, once you've mixed the substrate, you can lay across the top of the substrate some leaf litter. Now, the leaf litter, obviously, in a bioactive enclosure, will feed your custodians like your isopods and springtails. But on top of that, it just really adds to the aesthetics of the enclosure. I also find that royal pythons really love like moving between all of the leaves, and they also seem to love to smell them. But again, it just promotes that more natural behavior. But yeah, like I say, they do always seem very intrigued by the leaf litter. So personally, if you have gone bioactive, do make sure that you add some in. So yeah, like I say, I would personally recommend doing the whole bio mix. But if you do want a cheap sort of alternative, the cocoa husk is your best option, in my opinion. Now, I would also recommend that you have one cave inside your enclosure, which is designated to being a shedding cave or a shedding hide. And inside this cave, you're going to want to fill it with sphagnum moss and obviously keep regularly misting that and keep it sort of damp. Basically, what this cave is going to be for is when they're about to go into shed, they always have access to a higher percentage of humidity just to help them remove that skin in one piece rather than lots of little pieces. Now, since we're on the topic of caves, let's go over decoration. Now, personally, I would recommend a minimum of 3 caves, one on the hot side, one on the cold side, and one obviously being the shedding cave that we've just spoken about. Personally, I would recommend more though. They do love moving between the caves for different temperature ranges and as well as different humidity ranges. And you basically want to just scatter all of the caves around the enclosure. Now, you can actually use cork bark tubes as a hide as well as something for them to climb on and climb across. Nova here, he loves his cork bark tubes. He spends a lot of his time inside his cork bark tube. And then at night time, he tends to climb across it and wrap himself around it. In addition to this, you're going to want to have lots of branches, which will fill out the enclosure and create more depth and height and allow them to make the most of every area of that enclosure. You can get obviously cork branches, you can get stuff like Java wood, you can get grapevine. They all work great. You can also buy these kind of vines. Once they're adults, they do tend to squish them a bit, but the young ones, these work great for. But like I say, you can use loads of different kinds of twigs and sort of branches just to create that depth for the enclosure. You can also buy pre-made caves like these ones. And these work great too. And obviously they provide them a great hide. I personally find that they do love to hide inside these and they are perfect for them. In addition, you're going to want to make sure that you do provide a water bowl. If I'm honest, the bigger the better really. They do like to go inside them and have a little bath. But obviously, they also love to have a nice drink of water to stay hydrated. As an example of an enclosure that we've got currently set up in the shop, As you can see, we've got our biomix as well as the leaf litter. We've got a cave. We've got another cave at the back, which is behind that plant. You can't really see it. We've also got a nice cork bark tube cave, and there's also another little hide at the back of that corner too. And as you can see, we've got branches which allow them to climb on and just make use of that height and depth. If you've gone bioactive, you're going to be using live plants, but if you haven't gone bioactive, you're going to obviously want to put in some fake foliage. So I'll show you what they look like. Here's a few examples of some fake plants which you can use. There are lots on the market. It's just down to personal preference, but they do love to move between all of the fake plants as well as obviously live plants. It also really helps add to the aesthetics and makes your enclosure look very pretty. And basically what you want to do is completely fill out the enclosure, so then there's lots for them to do and climb across, and it just keeps them really active, to be honest with you. So now you have all of the information that you could possibly need in order to create a thriving enclosure for your pet royal python. So now let's discuss everything to do with feeding. So obviously earlier in the video we mentioned that you'll mainly be feeding defrosted frozen mice and rats, and the size of the rodent will depend on the size of your snake. Now for young baby and juvenile royal pythons, I recommend feeding every 7 to 10 days. And once they hit sub-adult to adult, you can move that feeding to once every 2 to 3 weeks. The most important thing to know when it comes down to feeding is you don't want to feed a prey item which is too big of a prey. You're better off going for something that's slightly smaller rather than giving them a prey item which is too big. You want to provide a rodent which is around the size of the widest part of your snake's body. Now, in my opinion, there is a better way which you can work out what size rodent you should feed in. And what you do is you weigh your snake and then you will feed a rodent which is 10% of the weight of your snake. So let's show you an example of this with Nova. What you want to do is get yourself a tub and some scales and get it to 0 grams. And then you're going to simply place your snake in. Nova weighs 1,085 grams. So if you go 1085 times 10%, that is the weight of the prey item. Another example would be if your snake was 80 grams. You would times that by 10% and that would give you an 8 gram prey item. That's a good way to sort of judge what size rodent you should be feeding to your snake. Now, when you're feeding, I would personally recommend that you get yourself some feeding tongs to hold the mouse or rat whilst you are offering them food, because they are lightning quick and obviously they are very notoriously known for accidentally missing their food and accidentally getting your hand. So obviously if you use a pair of tongs, it's less likely that they're going to miss that rodent and hit your hand. I also would personally recommend that you feed your snake outside of the enclosure. This basically prevents them becoming viv defensive, because if they associate their enclosure with only food, that every time that you open that enclosure, they're naturally going to think, oh my God, it's feeding time, even if you're just changing the water bowl. So obviously, if you only feed outside of the enclosure, they're going to let you do whatever you need to do whenever you open the enclosure, for example, changing the water. That's basically everything that you need to know about feeding. But there was something that I forgot to go over earlier, so we're going to quickly go over that now. You can actually go and buy these accessory kits, and it basically has everything that you need inside of it, other than the actual enclosure itself and the substrate. So as you can see, you get your thermostat, you get UV, you get obviously your heating equipment and the lamp guard, as well as the cage to go around your UV. You also get a few other bits and bobs just to get you going. I will be leaving links in the description below for all of the products which I have mentioned within this video. So that's basically everything that you need to know in order to get started and provide great outstanding care for your pet royal python, as well as provide it an on-point, stunning enclosure that they're going to thrive in. Like I say, with the correct setup and the correct care, these snakes make amazing pets, especially for beginners, and they are so fascinating to actually watch. So that's pretty much it for today's video, guys. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I really hope that you've learned something from this video. If you did enjoy this video, please consider dropping us a like, and also maybe consider subscribing. We've got a lot of content lined up for the future of the channel. If you have any questions about anything that I've mentioned in this video, please let me know in the comments below. I'd like to be able to answer your questions. And if there's any videos which you guys would be interested in me making, again, let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to be able to make them. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I shall see you in my next video. See ya!